Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we will be in Matthew chapter 6. If you will go ahead and open up there. Matthew chapter 6. And we have a lesson that is on a topic that seems all too typical for a preacher to be preaching on. And the topic is that of giving. But there is a blessing in being able to give a lesson on giving when giving is not much of a concern. I don't mean that from a spiritual perspective. It's always a concern, but what I'm saying is usually when you have a lesson on giving, it's because the budget's not being met. Usually when there's a lesson on giving, it's pleading with people to give more. And while Scripture will do that, we don't have to make that appeal right now. It's not a need that we have for people to give more and more unless they want to. But this morning is a reminder instead. And the reminder comes from the text here in Matthew 6. The reminder is from Christ that there's a way in which man gives and there's a way in which Christ would have us to give. And so we get to take a look at this, and we also get to see God's wisdom in action. That His plan for how we give is the best plan for how to give. And so let's go ahead and start into some of this. We'll start with verse 1 of Matthew chapter 6. It says, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven." Jesus is once again, in the Sermon on the Mount here, dealing with the practices of his day. He is combating the ideas of those who here he calls hypocrites, but almost certainly the religious leaders of his day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, the scribes, those who should be teaching the law to people, who are mishandling the law themselves. And here what he calls them out on is a practice that they have of doing their good works before others. In the context, it seems apparent that the charitable deeds, or some translations say almsgiving, or some translations say practicing righteousness, whatever you want to call it, it appears to be giving in the sense that we kind of think of as we give on Sundays as we've been commanded. So it's that picture that we have in mind, but Jesus is dealing with what the people of his day are doing. Well, what are they doing? Well, they're doing a couple of things. The thing that he points to here is how publicly they do this. But another problem that we might point out is they have ritualized giving, which that by itself may be a fear for us as well. If we get in the habit that we make it just a habit, just a ritual to give rather than it being something that we purpose in our hearts. And certainly we can. But they made this into a ritual, and part of that ritual involved making this as public as possible. And so what does he say about them? In verse 2, it says, "Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward." So the purpose of these individuals that are giving, the purpose is not to help others. The purpose is not to glorify God. The purpose, according to Christ, is to be seen. The purpose is to be heard. The purpose is to be admired by those that are around them. Those human eyes that are watching them. That's what they want. That's their greatest desire. He points out a specific example. He says that you should not do this, implying that these hypocrites do this. He says, don't sound a trumpet before you. Now, there's always been a debate as to what's been meant here. It's possible that this is purely figurative, that it just is a way of expressing the attention they were trying to draw. It's also possible that this was literal. It sounds crazy, but you can almost imagine that they might have someone go before them and herald by trumpet that they're about to do a good work and let everybody else know ahead of time, hey, watch this person do this great thing. The other suggestion, you've probably heard this before, is that they, at least in the temple, possibly in synagogues, in places where they would collect money, that there was a box, a metal container that was shaped, at least the mouth of it was shaped kind of like the flare of a trumpet. And so whenever you would put the silver coins or whatever it was that you had into that box, it would make quite a racket. And you can imagine if you had a lot to put in, and if you poured pretty slowly, that you could get a lot of attention in just that way. And so any of those things may be what Christ is referring to here. But to put that in sort of a modern day illustration, it would be kind of like this. You know, sometimes whenever somebody donates to, let's say, a school, and it's a business that's donating, and what they'll do is they'll somehow, I don't know where you get one of these, but they'll get one of those 5-foot long checks that are just massive. And they'll go out on the football field and they'll present it as this great and wonderful thing, and it probably is. But imagine next Sunday we come in and somebody from the back row, let's say Max, gets up and he pulls out this 5-foot long check, sorry Max, and he comes up to the front when it's time for the offering. And he lays that up there, he flashes it around so everybody can see the dollar amount on it. That's what these guys are doing here. Amazingly, that's the kind of attention that they desire. Christ, of course, is warning against that very thing. And the warning is pretty strong. The warning is pretty scary. Because what he says is that they desire this glory from men, and at the end of verse 2, assuredly I say to you, they have their reward. For all the good that might be accomplished through their giving, it doesn't really matter for them as individuals, because the reward that they desired was the praise of men. They will get that reward, but what reward will they not get? They will not get rewarded by the Father, by the one that actually should be given any kind of reward. So instead of this, instead of the way that man wants to give, which is essentially to be seen, to be admired, to be thought well of, Christ gives the alternative. So in verse 3, it says, "But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly." So here's the other way of giving, Christ's way of giving. Christ's way, instead, he starts with this, that you don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. Now that is proverbial. It's not meant to be taken as though you need to hold one hand behind your back as you do the giving, but you don't need to let everyone know what's going on. Now, from a practical point of view, that is a good thing. Why would that be a worthwhile thing to do, to not let everybody know what's going on? Well, just imagine this. Imagine that in our giving that we do Sunday to Sunday, as we've been shown in the New Testament, what if everyone here knew what everyone else was giving? Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but that's not what we see here. That's not the design. Instead, there's only really a few people that would even know potentially what you do give. It would be you and someone that's counting it and someone that's depositing it at the bank. So when we look at this, the problem we would run into is, if I know what you give and you know what I give, then what does that raise the potential for? Well, there's suddenly a temptation. And the temptation is that when I see what you give, I might think that you give too little, or I could even think that you give too much. I may think that you're giving irresponsibly. That would be kind of ironic, but we could do that too. But the problem is, if I'm thinking that based on what you give, then what am I really doing? One, I'm passing judgment. That's a problem. But two, what's that judgment based on? I'm basing that on a dollar amount that I see, and then I'm basing it on what I know of your life, which is how much, as far as your finances go. And how much do you know of what's going on in my household financially? And so I get to judge based on, at best, what car you're driving or what house you have. Of course, we all know that a lot of people have houses and cars that are much nicer than they can really afford in the first place. And so if this temptation arises and we are judging each other based on what we give, we're entering into a whole world of sin that very wisely we avoid if we don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. The other way that Christ phrases this is in verse 4, that your charitable deed may be in secret. So that is concealed, that is hidden. That doesn't mean that we have to do our giving behind the alleyway of the church and meet with a paper bag and hand it off secretly. It's not that we're embarrassed by giving. Instead, we are doing it in such a way that it is between us and God as it should be. And as we're shown here, God, who sees in secret, will reward us openly. The idea of a reward when we give seems a little counterintuitive, and it might even sound like something that we shouldn't be thinking about, but that's what the text says. It tells us that we can expect when we give that the reward will come as well. That same principle is exemplified in a lot of places in Scripture, actually, but it's the same principle from Luke 6:38. Give, and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over into your lap. It's that kind of reward that we're seeking out, okay? But when we give, we expect that reward, but we're not giving to get the reward. Besides that, what will the reward be? Well, it could be a lot of things, couldn't it? It could be something in this lifetime. We all know people who are generous here on earth who have a lot of good things come to them by the blessings of God. But it's also true that we could give and never get very much in return physically here, but the reward would be from God still after this life has ended. Regardless, we can expect to receive a reward, but that's not why we give in the first place. So here's the contrast in this text. On the one hand, we can give as man gives. What's that do? Well, it gives so that we can be seen, and the only reward is the praise of men. Or we can give as Christ would have us to give, which means we give in secret, and the only reward, which is the only reward we should want, is the praise of God and the blessing of God. Those are the two options that we have. Now we could add to this idea of how the New Testament tells us to give. We could certainly add to this that we, in addition to giving anonymously, you might say, as this text kind of teaches, that we give cheerfully. We read the text a lot from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, that we should be cheerful givers. We could talk about giving as we have prospered, and all of those things would be good and true. And we would just add those on to this. But the basic contrast is still the same. Either we give in man's way or we give in God's way. Those are the two options. And so what happens when we give in order to be pleasing to man? Because if we give in man's way, it will be pleasing to man. And it'll be pleasing to me, I guess. It may not be the greatest temptation that you have, but it may be that you desire the praise of men. And if you can give a lot, and you can do so in front of other people, then you will be praised for it most of the time. But ultimately, man's way of giving is only pleasing to man. But God's way of pleasing is pleasing to God, not surprisingly. And so the question for us would be, well, who do we want to please more? Would we rather be pleasing to man, or would we rather be pleasing to God? God has offered his reward if we're pleasing to him. What can man offer to us? If we give the way man would have us to give, what's the best that man can offer us? Maybe some tax breaks, maybe some publicity, maybe a good post on social media about us, maybe some kind of positive feedback. At worst, if we give in man's way, what can man give us? They can give us judgment. They can give us spite and jealousy. So there's not a whole lot that comes from giving the way that man would have us to, but Christ's way is better. But here's the question that arises for the individuals that Christ is speaking of in this text, these hypocrites that he calls them. Would they still give if no one was watching? The people that he's talking about, would they give if no one was watching? I think you know the answer to that. Another question, though, that we can ask with this, of course, would be more directed at us. Would we give if no one was watching? If we didn't think that anyone would find out, and we could get away with it for the rest of our lives, or maybe just when times are harder, would we not give anything? If somebody weren't watching over us, and we didn't think somebody would know, would we give? Now, on the other side of this, what if we knew that everybody would see how much we gave? What if every week, instead of it posting just the total number of the offering on the board, if it itemized it by each person that was given, would you give more? Now, here's the other way of looking at this. Whether everybody knows or whether nobody knows, the point of this text is to say it shouldn't change the amount that you give. Whether everybody could see it or whether nobody sees it, the only person that we should be giving to please is God. And He will see regardless of what we do. And He will reward as well with that. So there are a lot of benefits to the way that Christ has set this up. As I said at the beginning, part of this lesson is that we get to see the wisdom of God in action. God's wisdom is always on display in His church, and it's also on display here in the way that He would have us to give, which is to give pretty much anonymously. That is, to where no one else knows, and especially giving through the church in this way. So the first benefit that we could say that comes from giving in the way that Christ would have us to give is that it assures that we have a proper motive. Or maybe it just prevents us from having a bad motive. It's awfully hard to be giving, to be seen by others, if nobody sees what you give. And when you give through the church, there's much less temptation to be doing it just for show, because you know not many people are even going to know what you're giving in the first place. And so in God's wisdom, He's made a plan to where, yes, you give, you're doing charitable deeds, you're doing good things, but everybody doesn't know. And so it removes part of that temptation almost immediately. The second thing that it does is that it respects the privacy of the recipient of the gifts. So if, especially through the church, if someone receives some good that's done through the church, they'll probably accept that happily because it's through an organization of sorts. At least that's how they'll see it. But whenever instead it's given by an individual, that could cause some problems. It could be that they feel like they now owe this individual something, or something along those lines. That could be a problem. The other thing that it does, though, is imagine this situation that Jesus has described. What it says of these individuals, these hypocrites, it says that when they sound the trumpet, that they do it in the synagogues and in the streets. Well, in the synagogue makes sense. You have somewhere to put the money, but if we're talking about charitable deeds in general, and you're doing something good for somebody in the streets, what is that probably talking about? It's probably saying that in one sense or another, when they did a good work to a lame person, one that Jesus would have come along and healed, when they do some good work for somebody that couldn't help themselves, that's begging at the gate of the city, what did they do? Well, they made a scene of it. They made sure everybody saw them doing this good work. And what does that do to the person who was sitting there begging in the first place? How humiliating is it that this person is giving and is making a show of your situation for their benefit? Well, when we give through the church, again, one of the benefits is it protects the person that's receiving all of this. They don't have to be the center of attention, and the church is the one that's able to help in this way. The third thing that it does practically, though, it protects the giver. The person that gives individually. You're not going to get the phone calls about it. You're not going to get asked for more money from somebody who's received it from the church. It puts a layer between us and the person that's being helped, which could be a detriment in some ways, but in this way at least it's a positive. And the other thing that it does is that when we do give through the church, the greatest blessing is that all of the glory goes to God. That I don't have to worry about someone thinking better of me than I should be thought of, because instead they're pointed toward the church that Christ established. And they can give glory to God in that way. And so for us as individuals, what do we do with this? Well, first we ask, what is my motivation when I give? What am I thinking about? And hopefully, because of the way that God's designed it, hopefully the temptation is largely removed for it to be me thinking about what others will think of this. But at the same time, if that temptation's there, then certainly we need to test our own motivation, to examine ourselves before we give, and ask who we're doing this for, whether it's for myself or for God. The second thing is, we've been saying this whole time, whenever possible, give anonymously. Give through the church, or even if you're giving to an individual, give in a way that is not obviously about you as much as is possible. That being said, it's not always possible to give anonymously. And it's not always necessary to give through the church all of the time. Let me give you the example here. Christ gives one of his most famous parables about an individual that we refer to as the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan did not do a couple things. One, he didn't say, I'd like to help you, but I do all of my giving through the church and I never help anybody unless it's through the church. Well, he could have said that, but then the individual would have stayed there on the side of the road for a lot longer, may have died of their wounds after they'd been robbed, if that had been the only option. The other thing that he doesn't do, though, is he doesn't say, well, I'd like to help you, but I don't want the praise for this, so I'm not going to give to you as an individual. Well, what we're saying is there are times when you cannot give anonymously, and practically today, a lot of times the best way to get money from one person to another is via a check, which has your name and your address usually written right on it. And so sometimes it's not going to be anonymous, but even when it's not anonymous, it can still be private. It can still be done in secret. It still doesn't have to be a show that's put on for the benefit of others. And the last thing we would say is that whenever we give, however we give, whatever the method is, that the only person that deserves the credit, the only person that should be glorified is God the Father, the only person. And when we give in the way that Christ has told us to, that will be the result, that God is glorified and that he will reward us, but that he will be glorified first and foremost. And so when we give, we make sure that whoever we give to and however that's being done, that the individual that receives this, that they know that the blessing is a blessing from God, as all blessings are blessings from God, and not from myself individually. So when we give not to be seen by men, but we give knowing that God is seeing that action, that he will reward us openly, that he will reward us eternally as well. This lesson has been aimed at this one subject out of this one text. And yet at the end of it, we want to open it up a little bit wider to offer God's invitation. God's invitation is quite easy to give when you're talking about this subject of giving, because God has given to us everything that we have ever had and everything that we could ever want, and even more. And above all of that, God has given us his Son, the indescribable gift of his sacrifice and his love for us. This morning, if you need to respond to the invitation of God, this is the opportunity that's been set up for you. If you need to know more about the plan that God has for salvation, if you have questions of the congregation, or this morning if you need to respond for some other reason, for some other need, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.